welcome to Cow Daily. Today we have esteemed doctor and epidemiologist, Dr. Deepti Gurdasani. On a personal level, the reason I've asked Deepti to come on, actually, I'll just bring Deepti in. I'll tell her how you doing. I want to just tell you something before we do the interview and work and all of that stuff, right? On a personal level, right? During the lockdowns and everything, your appearances on Navarra really gave my family like a lot of help. And just on that, and I know you get lots of crap off people online, I wanted to try and counter that a bit before we start. This isn't the podcast, this is me just talking to you.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Really, though, thanks so much. I don't think you understand the many more people you've helped, because the loud ones always seem to get the airtime, don't they? So thanks, mate, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear.
Yeah, I mean, look, I followed you for a while since then, obviously, and I see what you get, and it's just so unjustified. It drives me mad, and it's actually directed at you. So, like, should we just start there? Like, how does it feel, right, to be who you are? You're an expert in your field, and every time you post something on Twitter, you just get attacked. Like, how does that feel?
Well, I mean, obviously it doesn't feel great, but I think, the way I thought about it for a while is that if you're not actually that a lot of that is a sign that you're sort of challenging narratives that make and making people uncomfortable, because the response is always to a challenge. If you weren't making a difference, then people wouldn't feel that threatened and they wouldn't feel like shutting you down that much. So for me, it's also a sign that, I am being heard and I am making a difference, because people do need to shut it down. So I think that's a positive side of it. Also, I just want to say that I don't see as much as many other people see of the criticism, because I'm very, very liberal with blocking. So actually, I see a lot more of the supportive responses, and the support, I have to say, has been absolutely overwhelming, and it's also helped me kind of get through on a personal level, because I've learned a lot from the disability advocacy community. As you know, I'm also immunocompromised and disabled, and there have been a lot of people that I've learned a lot from over the last
Yeah.
3 years, and that's been a great experience. And I don't think that could have happened without actually having that platform on Twitter.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm really pleased that you've done that blocking, because I think some of the stuff. I mean, it's just crazy. I'm pleased you don't say it. I mean, there's no need to say it either. And I mean, I've got a smaller platform than you, and I get enough. And sometimes it did hurt, but I've just decided to like block if it's personal. I'm like I'm sure you're the same. You'll debate anybody if it's in good faith, but there's not a lot of that to be had on social media when it comes to this.
Absolutely. I can pick up very quickly whether discussions like sea lining are going to be in good faith or not. And if it's not in good faith, I just block. I don't engage at all, because I feel like it's a waste of emotional energy and time. And also, a lot of
Yeah.
the time, like, I don't think it's actually personal. I think there are bots, and I think it's a coordinated campaign. And if you look at it as a coordinated campaign, that's aim is to sort of shut you down, then you really choose your interactions and deal with it largely by ignoring it, and making sure your message actually gets out.
Well, that's good advice for anybody who's trying to do any kind of campaign. And I think, just on COVID as well. I mean, as we're in 2023, what do you believe are the most significant challenges we face in terms of COVID, and how can we as individuals and communities best address them? And obviously within the context of it being a politicized thing as well as a public health thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest challenge we actually face is misinformation and lack of accurate information. Because, I mean, there has been a coordinated campaign, not just by vested interests, but also, governments and public health agencies to sort of underplay the importance of COVID, and particularly its longer term impacts. So, long COVID is something that I feel the public isn't really aware of the consequence in their lives, sadly, until either they get affected or somebody they care about or love gets affected. And I think that will have a huge impact in the future. And I think the challenge for us is how we combat that and make people understand that this remains a serious threat despite vaccination, because high levels are still circulating and it's continuing to affect people on a day-to-day basis. And even though the impacts might not be felt immediately, it's an important problem that we need to address right now.
Yeah, just on that. I mean, I was going to ask you that later, but let's do it now. What I've been reading about lately has really troubled me in terms of like repeat infections and how it can open people up to dormant viruses or end of life illnesses. Could you expand on that for us and let us know what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody has a full hold on things, but I think there are a number of concerning things about the virus. So, one is, of course, long COVID. And with long COVID, there's increasing amounts of evidence that, at least in some people, long COVID is the result of inflammation because of a persistent virus. So, it could be like persistent parts of the virus, so like the virus protein, or it could be the virus that's replicating. We don't exactly know, and it's not uncommon. It's not that it happens only in people who are, say, immunocompromised. It's a virus that can persist in different tissues in the body without being detected in our sort of
Mm,
nasal sampling, even in healthy people. So in the gut, in numerous tissues in the body, as well as the brain. So these are things that are very, very concerning, because should we be thinking of this more as a chronic illness that doesn't clear for everyone? The other is, of course, the impact that it has on other viruses. So I think
yeah.
quite early on, we had evidence that COVID infection could lead to reactivation of other viruses that are latent, like, Epstein-Barr virus or cytomegalovirus. And there have been a few large studies with rather concerning results showing that people who develop COVID in the post-COVID period are at risk of potentially other respiratory infections, other infections like RSV, for example, in children,
Mm,
as well as streptococcus tonsillitis, and that increased risk can persist for long periods of time. So again, we don't know these associations are absolutely cause and effect, but the fact that you see this increased risk in people who develop COVID compared to people who don't, when you try and match for other factors that might be associated with infection, you see that increased risk suggests that there might be some level of immune dysfunction or inflammation for whatever reason that we don't fully understand. So again, it's the long-term consequences that really worry me more than the acute consequences. But
mm,
even acute infection, even now, if you really look at it, we're having a significant number of deaths every day. People talk about it less, but it's certainly not insignificant. I mean, for example, in England, for a lot of the time, you see very high levels of hospitalization still, and of course, the peaks seem smaller, but that's because they're taking off from a higher and higher baseline. So the burden on healthcare, the number of people getting hospitalized, the number of people dying every week is still quite significant.
mm. Understood. Um, I mean, I myself, I'm not sure because I think it was asymptomatic, but I think a bout of COVID may have triggered shingles in me, and I had a really bad case of it. And the after effects and whatever lasted about a year, so I assume like a kind of long COVID response to it. Additionally, and recently, there's people I know. One's a DJ. He had a gig and he had a stroke on the toilet after his gig at 5 a.m. There's another friend who's a care worker. He got repeated COVID infections and he has just been discharged from the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Gateshead in the northeast. He was in the lung ward, then he was in the heart ward, so he's had issues there. Like from what you said earlier, you were saying that there's been like sort of things being minimized by health agencies and other things of that nature. If this is going to like bring forward things like end of life stuff, but also put this kind of stuff in the more long term when it breaks down the body, how will we know it's linked to COVID if we're not tracking this?
I mean, that's a real problem, isn't it? Because we
Mm,
won't. I mean, that's a fact. We've largely stopped testing. It's up to people whether they do rapid tests or not. But for most people, this is like the flu. So what is the point of getting tested? So looking at things like the consequences of new variants, or linking COVID to long-term effects like heart attacks, strokes, pulmonary embolisms, it's really, really hard.
mm,
It's hard for multiple reasons. One, we don't have clear testing and linking. Second, the medical community often isn't aware that COVID is a risk factor for these things, so the link is often not made when you find a young person coming in without the risk factors, traditional risk factors, I should say, because we know COVID is a risk factor for those sort of things. And often people aren't aware, so they don't know that their risk profile has changed when they've got COVID. And repeated infections are even more complicated to pick up, because we know, for example, in the UK, about not only has about 90% of the population been infected at least once, we know there's been high rate of reinfection. So reinfection rates have been around 50% at least. And that means that many people have had more than one infection. But then if people aren't really monitoring when they get infected, if they're treating it as a cold, then how do we understand the long-term impact of reinfections in the future? So I think we've really scuppered our ability to be able to understand the long-term consequences and respond. Whether that's deliberate or not, I don't know, but it's certainly not the smart thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's rather sobering hearing you say that, and I hoped you wouldn't say that. That would be scuppered, but it's kind of like now it seems like there's plausible deniability for the powers that be. And I mean, just on that level, like from the political level, like what's been your personal experience or just wider experience, like with the way politics has dealt with this pandemic? Because to my mind, politicians shouldn't be anywhere near a public health response. I think that's been proven, but what's your opinion?
So I think my initial response was that I was surprised, but now looking back, I guess I shouldn't have been. I mean, if you look at every single public health threat like this in history, where the response would have perhaps hurt vested interests, this has happened. So if you look at the links, for example, between smoking and lung cancer, they were known for a really, really long time before any regulation and policy was done. And, a lot of that push was from grassroots movements. It's not like politicians came in and said, hey, we need to protect public health, so we need to, make these policies. And it took decades of denial, even by quoting fringe scientists, pretty much what we're seeing now. And we've seen the same story with climate change, right? I mean, we've known climate change for years. We know this is potentially an extinction event, and we still don't have policies for this. And if you look at it, in my view, ultimately governments work for the more privileged and the corporate interests and vested interests, and there doesn't seem to be any interest in those entities to protect public health. So I think this is something that we have to fight for at grassroots level as people who are going to be most affected by this, because we can't expect governments to do very much. So I'd like to say I'm surprised, but I think history shows that this is what happens every single time.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I mean, we've talked recently about like the great forgetting after I don't like calling it the Spanish flu. I know that was just what it was branded as, but so, I mean, just for people who don't know on the screen, for audio people, this is from history.com, and few personal stories were published. It wasn't just doctors. No one really wanted to talk or write about what it was like to live through the flu. Newspaper articles about the pandemic didn't usually describe the personal stories of those who died or survived. With that in mind, Deepti, do you think we're in Great Forgetting 2.0?
Well, I think it's beyond 2.0.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting now that, there is research being done on the long-term effects of COVID. People are also looking at the long-term effects of flu, what people consider, the common cold. And, it shows that with every flu infection, there was a large study, I think, from Denmark that showed it increases your risk of neurodegenerative disease. So things like dementia, Parkinsonism. So it's very likely that, we've been exposed to many, many, many things that are harmful, that are harmful to public health. So, if you talk to patients with myalgic encephalitis and chronic fatigue syndrome, many of them have been disabled by what people consider to be simple illnesses. We've very recently understood the connection between Epstein-Barr virus and multiple sclerosis, which we know is a very serious and disabling disease. So, how much is there that we don't know? Perhaps, the real answer to these things is that getting exposed to multiple infectious diseases was never a good thing. And COVID has really, really brought this to the fore, because the long-term impacts are so are not uncommon. They're common and they're disabling. So we're seeing the impacts now, but the thing is, the solutions to all of these things are collective. So things like clean air, for example, would help with all of these diseases, not even a single disease. So the solutions should be looked at as something that, perhaps massively improves public health in so many ways without, being even specific to COVID.
Yeah, I've got you, man. You mentioned sort of mitigations and whatnot. In an ideal world, say you were given the job of public health dictator, for want of a better word, right? And it was all on you. What would be your perfect public health response? Like, what would be the things that you would say, right, this is what's going to save as many lives, but not only that, stop the infection, stop the,
Yeah.
not maybe end of life stuff, but the disablements and things of that nature?
So, I think public engagement has to be in the heart of it. So you can't just, impose things on people. They have to understand that actually their health is at risk and that it can be massively improved by having certain things in place. So I think information about airborne transmission of the virus and how it can be massively reduced by two-way, not one-way, well-fitting masks, provision of well-fitting masks to everyone. So, it's not sort of something for the privileged. Clean air, so provision of clean air through air filtration in the short term, and in the long term, changing ventilation systems and infrastructure to be better ventilated, more open, particularly in environments where high levels of transmission occur, like in schools, and where even children's development and cognitive abilities can suffer because of very high levels of carbon dioxide and buildup and crowding. So those would be, I think, the initial things like free tests available with support for isolation, financial support, carer support, for parents, and practical support, like pharmacies, groceries, all of that sort of thing to ensure that people can really isolate without taking a hit in their personal lives. So yeah, I mean, those would be the things, and of course continuing vaccination, and not just for very, very limited groups, but even for children, because children do sadly suffer with long COVID and acute effects of infection. And antivirals, broader availability of antivirals, not just to extremely limited groups. I think that would probably be my wish list. I don't know if I've forgotten something.
I would like to make you world queen. Would you accept? I'd like you to run
That sounds
things.
very, very stressful and very colonial. So I
Yeah,
think I'll
well,
pass.
as a figure of speech, I've pivoted to run things instead. But honestly, I'd like you to be doing this. I mean, I recently spoke with the deputy leader of the Green Party, Zach Polanski, and asked him about filter systems. I mean, you probably see I've got one over my shoulder there, because I've
Yeah,
learned.
I can do that.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
partly down to you actually, just following you, finding out what to do. So I went and bought one. Changes the air in the room every 5 times an hour.
Wow, that's
So yeah,
great.
the
Yeah.
reason being is I was recently on a book. Actually, I'll tell you about Zach first. I mean, what he did was, like, which is quite different for a politician. We had a little bit of pushback about it, but he emailed me back the next day and said that Caroline Lucas was speaking at the all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus. Said, "Have you got any evidence?" So we've sent him a load. So there seems to be a mechanism developing, and I think part of what we're trying to do is that thing that you spoke to before. People just don't seem to know. They're just like, I mean, Zach was across it more than most politicians because they're just ignoring it, but he's not. But there's a dearth of information. So, like, how do we change that? Like, what do we do?
So, I mean, I think there's a huge disparity in the thinking of people who are more privileged, who perhaps have seen less of the impacts of COVID, and people who are already struggling with chronic disease, disabled, and really worried about their health, people who are clinically vulnerable, or people who have family members who are clinically vulnerable, and parents of children who are clinically vulnerable. I think that's basically the problem. So you have this class of privileged people who actually in some cases have the protections. Like we know that, the protections that are in parliament, for example, and in Davos were far greater than you see in many other parts of the world. So, they are right to be protected. Many of them can work remotely. They are far less affected by public policy because they can, I guess, manage to shield somewhat, versus, people who are poorer, ethnic minorities, clinically vulnerable, who are probably impacted more. And I think that is basically the problem. There is an inequity that's a result of COVID and a result of policy. And it is basically discriminatory because public health policies need to work for everybody.
Yeah.
um, so you have to actually start with the people who are perhaps most at risk, and they need to work for them. And for that to happen, it needs to be safe for everyone. And
Mm.
I don't see that happening from top down, again, because I think there is always going to be that presence of vested interest pushing a different agenda. And I think also people who are privileged often don't see the impacts in reality on the people that these things impact the most, because there's a huge disparity in COVID impacts. So I think grassroots movements are going to push this, and I think it's going to take a really, really long time to push for change.
Mm.
And in the meantime, there are people who are going to suffer, as they have with every single um, public health threat that has come into place in the past. I think there's never been a swift government response, and I think it's up to us as people who are COVID cautious, who care about COVID, people who are disabled, people who are already suffering from long COVID, MECFS, clinically vulnerable, parents, teachers, health and social care workers, to really push for that change.
Understood. So, I mean, I think for me, we tend to wrestle with taboo topics quite a lot, and COVID has become a taboo. Like,
Yeah.
what's that about, though? I mean, just on what possible level could it be
Yeah.
made a taboo? I think for me, it fits into the psychological aspects of like a great forgetting and how people are just ignoring and whatever and throwing themselves. Because we saw the Roaring Twenties after the pandemic in 1918. So do you think people are just so sick of like constantly being overclocked with the brain, they've just went off and they're just ignoring? What do you think's going on psychologically?
I think there's a level of cognitive dissonance. So I think people are actually at some level worried about this. But I think a lot of people, especially people who are more privileged, live in a sort of bubble that, really bad things don't happen to us, right? They happen to other
Mm,
people. We live in this world where things aren't arbitrary or random, essentially, generally our government wouldn't not kind of protect us if this was really a risk. So I think there's a dissonance between sort of that sort of safety bubble sort of thinking and the reality when you're faced with, oh my God, here's a virus that is infecting a huge number of people every single week and has effects on every single system in the body. And this getting one infection could increase my risk of heart attacks, strokes, diabetes substantially a year down the line, my risk of dying essentially. And I think it's very hard for people to sort of accept that, accept the cognitive dissonance of my government would let this happen. I mean, surely
yeah.
surely that can't be right, because we have a safety net. We live in the UK, which is this like, what do I say, one of the world leading countries. How could that possibly happen? So somebody must be wrong about this, and I
Mm,
don't want to hear about it, because if I do, it's really, really terrifying that something like that can happen to me in this country. And I think a lot of
yeah.
people live in that safety bubble, which is why I think they don't really see the clarity. And I think people who are less privileged don't live in that safety bubble. They know really horrible things happen to
Yeah.
people. The world isn't just, and the government doesn't protect you. And if you have that view, then it's easy to then understand and accept that this is yet another one of those things where you're being let down and you have to fight for it.
Yeah, I understand. So the general message is we're going to have to fight for this. There's going to be no gimmies here. I mean, the thing is, I found out recently that they've got filter systems in the Palace of Westminster, in the Ministry of Defence, and they're in every room at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Now, we
Yeah.
spoke about misinformation, and a lot of the people also have like, this thing about the World Economic Forum. So you would think that with conspiracy theorists, and I'm thinking this might be an in because I do have dialogue, that
Yeah.
it would be like, if you're so against these people who tend to run the world, in your opinion, why have they got these in every room if it's not real? So, I mean, I'm just trying to come up with things to just try and intervene or whatever, because it's all around me. I'm from a working class area, and like Newcastle is a world center for anti-vax bullshit. One of the
Right.
big marches was there. It links in with this guy who's like all about the 5G and all of that. And I've seen a real change. Just on that, actually, you know, I mentioned earlier I had like about a year where I just couldn't do podcasts and I couldn't write. I had brain fog. It was ridiculous. So when I did come back, I hadn't been online at all, like just checked in with people for a while. I'm all right, but I'm trying to get better, so I'm staying away. When I did come back and I was healthy, I wrote about clinically vulnerable people and clinically extremely vulnerable people, thinking the people that follow us tend to be like on balance, like really nice. And it was about 50-50 between like, yeah, that's right, nice one, great to see you back, and shut up, heretic, this is all over now. And then I'd be like, well, what about these people? And it would just be like, some people would be like, what am I going to do about it? I was like, what? So
Not
do
my
you feel like that rebound effect is like continuing in terms of it's making people a bit colder?
The rebound effect from
Well, just the rebound effect from like that period. So I'm talking about like lockdowns, the psychological impact of this.
Yeah.
When people were in the house, they were just like, you know, they sat in front of the computers having bullshit poured into their faces, you know, and they were a receptive audience for like anti-vax conspiracy theories. So I'm wondering, because that's a gateway to the wider firmament of conspiracies. Do you feel that like, sorry, go ahead.
I think media is playing a huge role, and it's not just fringe media, you know, like fringe right wing media. I think that's played a big role, but I think even mainstream media. I mean, where in mainstream media do you see anything about the seriousness of COVID, about how it's transmitted, about how to really mitigate? I mean, most of the stuff that I saw, even on BBC News, even many of the interviews that I participated in, I mean, I think they were quite far away from reality or even scientific consensus. So I think a lot of the narratives that we see on the news are manufactured, you know, and media isn't independent either. And I think, you know, unless you really critically appraise every bit of information that you're getting, you really get sucked into it, you know, unless you're kind of actively you know, following the research on things, you're not really understanding the scientific consensus. I also have a slightly more cynical view on this. So I think we do live in an ableist society. I think we always have.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, if you look at history in the UK and the US, it was the heart of the eugenics movement as well. And, you know, while that movement became unpopular, it was mainstream at one point in time, you know, in the UK. And there were scientists who were mainstream in the biggest institutes in the UK and quite famous and popular at the time. So to me, you know, the ableism and this idea of, you know, ultimately this is going to affect a few people, or perhaps elderly people, you know, who are, you know, going to die, and it's just going to sort of move their dying up a bit, you know, but we can't really make sacrifices for this group of people. I think those narratives are very much entrenched in our society. That thinking is entrenched in our society. I know people haven't come out and said it in exactly the same way as we've seen it said during COVID, but I think it's part of our society. And anybody who is disabled, you know, clinically vulnerable, will tell you that this has historically been a huge part of society. And I know a lot of the ableism has come to light now, but I think it's sort of, rather than being a new thing, it sort of showcases a very dark side to society that has always existed, you know.
Indeed, and just on that, I think the whole like population management, social engineering of programs like Benefits Britain and all of that kind of crap has kind of really set the groundwork for this, you know, very much targeting disabled people. Just like, I know that you've moved recently, you moved to Australia. Like, why did you decide to move?
Well, I mean, I think as a family, we sort of felt, one, that our lives had become really, really small in the UK because of really ableist and unequal policies, which, you know, frankly, force people like me, immunocompromised, and our families into a future of perpetual shielding, unless you want to take the risk to become really, really ill. And of course, the breakdown of the healthcare system. I mean, there were so many things. You know, the fact that if you were ill, you might not be able to get an ambulance for a life-threatening emergency was frankly quite scary. And I think the general move of the UK, you know, in terms of Brexit, economic consequences, corruption in government, becoming more and more authoritarian, less and less accountability, regulation, human rights, increase in hate crime and racism. I think all of those put together made us feel it wasn't the place we wanted our daughter to grow up, and we wanted a better life for her. So, we decided to make the move to Western Australia, which at the time had better COVID policy, possibly not anymore, but people are certainly more COVID aware. Masking is more common, although not very common. But just things like the climate and the architecture and
Yeah.
less inequality makes, in terms of COVID, it makes it a bit safer. Our daughter has more of a life. There's outdoor swimming, more stuff happening on beaches and parks, and her life, which had really diminished in the UK, is so much more richer now. And I think that was our primary aim, and I feel really validated having made that decision, just seeing her thriving here.
It's magic, man. I'm pleased for you. It's just, I just think like anybody who can gain some happiness at the moment, you got to go for it, haven't you? And I share your assessment about Britain too, and hopefully we can fix it, but it's going to be a long haul, I think. If it's all right, we'll just pull up some questions from the people who listen and watch. We sent a few through this morning, if it'll come up here. This from Carlos. Is there an organisation collecting information on the new variants of COVID being reported as the UK appears to be trying to forget the public into moving on from COVID now, including the reporting increased forcing of workers back into offices? So obviously the question is anybody tracking or collecting information currently?
So the COVID Genomics Consortium, which is called, I think, COG UK, is supposed to be doing this. So they, I think, publish a website that is updated. You don't hear very much about it. So unless you're a kind of specialist following this area, it's going to be pretty hard to track. I think the UK Health Security Agency puts out arbitrary updates once in a while, but it's not sort of regular. So I don't know if there's a kind of regular way to follow it. Experts tend to follow it on sort of things like COG UK, and there's another website called Outbreak Info. But I wouldn't know how you could necessarily regularly follow that if you aren't actually following it on those websites.
Yeah, got you. I'll just scroll back to this one here. This is from Steve Jackson. Has the risk reduced as time has gone on, or is it just on the basis of how busy the NHS wards are? Also, why has the public vaccination stopped when we were worried the virus mutated so fast the original vaccine was no longer as effective?
So has the risk fallen? I mean, certainly the risk of death and hospitalization per infection has fallen after vaccination. But of course, as you've pointed out, vaccination wanes, even protection from severe disease wanes over time, although it wanes less. So, and we have much, much more infection happening. So that kind of catches up the sort of, to some extent, the sort of reduction in the risk of acute infection per infection. In terms of long COVID, I think we don't know very much, to be honest. So
yeah.
In terms of reinfection, what the risk of long COVID is, I think the only evidence we have right now suggests that reinfection isn't necessarily benign. So, your risk of organ dysfunction, strokes, heart disease, all of that cumulatively increases with every infection. How that changes exactly with booster vaccinations, and with Omicron, again, it's not something that, and with different variants, is not something that we have an answer to because, as you said, we're not really monitoring this. So we are not really keeping up in terms of the evidence with how things are changing. I'm trying to remember the other question. Sorry, there was another question that I think I missed.
I'll pull it back up for you. Here we go. So has the risk reduced as time has gone on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand that bit at all. Why boosting? Boosting is not happening regularly across all age groups. I mean, we have so much evidence. One, that SARS-CoV-2 evolves more rapidly than many other viruses, and that evolution has been, towards more and more escape quite rapidly. And we know that given how far the virus has evolved from the original variants and even from the updated bivalent vaccine, that there is a high level of escape, and that protection against infection, for example, reduces very, very quickly, and even protection against severe disease wanes. So, I mean, my thinking is that we should be giving people boosters regularly and not annually. I think, they need to kind of keep up with the pace of virus evolution because, for example, the current XBB variants that are kind of spreading across the world are supposed to be, escape current vaccines quite well in terms of, I think, protection from infection and transmission, perhaps less so with severe disease. But we don't actually know that. So I would be working hard on updating these vaccines and giving boosters to all age groups regularly. So I'm not exactly sure why the government it has been slow on that, or many governments across the world have stopped
Yeah.
doing that.
Understood, mate. You've been really generous with your time. There's just a couple more questions, and then we'll let you get back to your world there. But so this is from Zoe, and Zoe's one of the people that makes me want to like keep talking about this. She's clinically vulnerable. Just one of the people we've been talking about, and I always think about Zoe and other friends as well. So what she's saying is, for the audio people, so much I want to ask, but I don't think I'm going to make the live. Not a great mental health day for me. I'll watch back later. Main things are how we can judge the dangers now. Almost data to stop being published. Are there any alternatives to jabs yet, or in testing stages? I've had a bad reaction, number 3, and don't want any more now. And just to thank her for all she and everyone else involved with Indie Sage, etc., have done to help us guide us through hell. Have a good show. It's lovely.
Yeah, well, I would say that in terms of vaccination, yeah, I completely understand if you're vaccine injured and you've had a bad reaction, you may not want to take another dose of mRNA. In that case, I don't know if this is available in the UK, but in most other countries, we have Novavax, which is supposed to have a better side effect profile. And I mean, in terms of new variants, we think it's possibly as effective as some of the upgraded variant vaccines. I think Novavax is also working on upgrading to current variants, but Novavax, even wild type variant vaccine, would be an option for you in most parts of the world, but I'm not sure about what's happening in the UK, so you would have to look that up. But that would have a different safety profile because of the way that the vaccine is configured compared to mRNA vaccine. So certainly, if you have vaccine injury, I would consider that option.
Cool. Last question. It's a personal one from me, really. And my partner's a physiotherapist. She works in a kind of like 10-meter by 10-meter clinic to our own practice. Is there a way that we could mitigate against her ever catching it by installing filters, masking? Like, is there a way to just basically say you're 100% not going to get COVID? No.
I don't think you can ever drop the risk to 0%. I think you can mitigate to very, very high levels. So, for example, wearing a well-fitting N95 or N99 mask and never taking it off. So, doing a fit test and make sure you never take it off in the room.
Yeah.
And having
is that while clients are there, or just generally she would have to keep it on all day?
So I would have it while clients are there, but even after the clients leave the room, if you have filters on, until the filter has done a number of air exchanges.
Yeah.
So maybe keep it on for, depending on the level of ventilation of the air exchanges, for another half an hour or so, because, aerosols can hang around in the air even when people aren't around.
So would you say half an hour gap between, sorry to butt in, but half an hour gap between people would be good? So see somebody, half an hour gap, let the air exchange, then see somebody after half an hour.
Oh, I mean, if she's wearing if they're wearing a well-fitting kind of high-grade mask, then I don't think it needs to be a gap. It depends on who you're trying to protect. If you're trying to protect yourself, then, if you're wearing a well-fitting mask and you have the filter going, that's fine. If you want your patients to be protected, then you might need to consider having either a very, very high filtration rate, or having gaps between them, so that, or mandating well-fitting masks that you provide for them to really reduce the amount of aerosol in the air. So I think there are multiple things that you can do, and the more layers of protection you have, the less likely you'll get infected, and also the less likely patients will get infected from each other.
It's magic, mate. And like, it's nice on the way out that you gave my family some more quality information, but this time directly. So thanks so much. Honestly, I really appreciate you just as a human being. You've done some cracking work throughout this entire time. I bet you've saved a lot of lives, because you've informed us, and we didn't have a bloody clue at the start of all of this. We didn't have a clue. So it was people like you that possibly why I'm still here. So thanks, mate.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you would have found the information anyway, but thank you.
Well, maybe I would have done, but I don't want to downplay it. I genuinely mean that. Like, you were one of the go-to people, so it's a real honor to be able to tell you that to your face. And if we never speak again, I hope you have the very best of life with your families.
Thank you, and you too.
All the best, mate. Thank you so much for being here and being generous with your time. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye. That was Deepti there. What a lovely woman she is, man. Like, seriously, like, as I said to her, and it is a real honor to be able to tell her that, and I know she's helped so many other people, and I think it's important in 2023, after everything that we've all been through, to honor and praise people who've done great work, because I think we're too quick to jump on people left and right, and also we've got to protect people like her because, you know, fair play, she's blocking people, but some of the stuff that people like Deepti get online is absolutely vile. Probably bots as well, a lot of it, but yeah, protect the good ones. So anyway, if you want to support my work, please go to patreon.com/cow daily. That's patreon.com/cow daily. Link in the description for PayPal if you want to make a one-off contribution to our work. Also, thank you to everybody generally for being here. I mean, obviously, this is one that we're doing on COVID, but as you know, I haven't been able to book guests and talk to them because, quite ironically for this show, I wasn't well enough, and I kept going up and down with this long COVID virus, whatever the hell it was. One day we'll find out because I'll be able to afford the tests. But yeah, it's just nice to be able to sit and actually, it feels like from a personal perspective, it feels like full circle. Like watching Deepti when I was really ill and being worried to getting to this point now where I'm healthy enough, and part of that is down to you keeping me here and lifting me up and enabling me to get to the point where it really does just feel like the beginning again, like we're like relaunching properly, because my good health has met sort of, you know, the momentum of what we're doing, and it's been over 5 years. Obviously, as you know, before that, if people are just tuning in now, I had a spinal surgery, so it all kind of stacked up for me, the isolation and things like that. And I just want to say this to people as well, and I understand that like the isolation that we've all experienced due to lockdowns and whatever was terrible. I myself was doing that like alone, like for a year after my spinal surgery, when I was learning to like walk properly again and couldn't really get out the house and all that. So I already had a load of that stacked up before lockdown. So I went mad when Boris Johnson announced it. If I had a cat, it would have ended up in Australia, like being looked after by Deepti, I think. Because I would have kicked it that far. I wouldn't have really down with animal abuse, but you get my point. So just thanks, because yous out there, if you're listening on the playback, if you're watching this live, and just anybody, like people who maybe don't even tune in the show, you'll never hear this, but like, you know, like people on our social media as well, thank you very much. Feels like a completion cycle to me, and big up Deepti and all of our family as well. And let's just keep putting the pressure on. I'm not going to live in a world where clinically vulnerable people have to stay in the house, and I'm going to do everything that I can to at least make it so the people who are doing this are mugged clean off. And that's often the starting point for getting these bloody filters in. One over my shoulder there, that way or that way. That way. It's all in reverse on the screen. Anyway, have a really nice day, everybody. And I think I'm going to too. Really nice to feel uplifted talking to people like Deepti and just think, you know, we've got a chance. Knowledge is power. Bye now.